Hello and welcome back to Kvikmyndapod, an Icelandic cinema podcast. I'm Rob Watts, and on this podcast, me and my good friend Ellie Cawthorne chat about Icelandic film. So far on our journey through the films of 21st century Iceland, we've been up to see some sheep farmers in the north and hung around the capital, Reykjavik, with two very different groups of people. This week, we're using Reykjavik as a base and journeying out to the suburbs and beyond to solve a murder. In Jar City, or Mýrin, from 2006, we see just how far Baltasar Kormákur has come as a director in quite a short space of time. And that title isn't a nickname for the capital, rather a room full of history and rather gross things in jars. To find out more, listen on as we discuss Jar City. Hello!
Hello.
How you doing?
I'm good, thanks. It's very gross and rainy outside, so perfect day for a podcast.
Yes, and I was thinking it's very much like the weather that we see in the film we're discussing today.
Yep, grey upon grey upon grey.
Yeah, pretty miserable. But thankfully, well, from my end anyway, there's been no kind of drama, the likes of which we'll be talking about.
From your end, at least.
Yeah, I don't want to assume for
end.
you that there's been no child death or murder. Anyway. Yes, but we are talking about Jar City from 2006, or Mýrin is the Icelandic name. And can you guess who directed this one?
Is it fair to say I'm guessing if I already know?
No, but you can tell us anyway.
I can tell you. Baltasar Kormákur.
Yes, 101 Reykjavik guy. And this is his sort of breakthrough hit from 2006. It's based on a novel, which is the first the fourth in the Icelandic run, but the first in those that got published in English, of a series of crime thrillers based around the Detective Erlendur.
How does that work then? They just didn't publish one of them in English. They thought this one's a bit of a crap second one.
Yeah, like maybe three books that they didn't publish. Then this one did well, and then they went from there. I think, anyway. I've never read the first three, but I've read a few of them. And so I don't think we even mentioned it in the 101 Reykjavik podcast, but that was an adaptation as well of a novel by Hallgrímur Helgason. And both times Kormákur's directed and written the screenplay. So it'll be quite interesting to see how this one compares to that one, because it's basically done the same thing, but with a completely different style of novel and film.
But I would argue that those 6 years between 2000 and 2006, Balthazar's been off there doing some good work, because those years have done him good, because this, to me, was a much stronger film than 101 Reykjavik.
Absolutely.
And in fact, I wouldn't ever have guessed, unless I'd known beforehand, as I did, that they were by the same director. I don't know if you felt like that too. I
probably would say, it's not a distinctive style that he has. No. But watching it this time round, having so recently watched 101 Reykjavik, there are a couple of kind of in-jokes or camera-style things going on that are similar. But yeah, it's so different as a film that you couldn't really draw a comparison. So, quick synopsis, and this is probably the briefest one that I'll do all series. So, a young girl dies of natural causes, an old man is murdered, Detective Erlendur investigates and discovers that the two deaths may be linked. This is a film about history, family, and GDPR.
You really had me until GDPR, and then I was out. You make it sound incredibly boring. But yes, in a sense, yes.
You get my meaning, right?
Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, so this was the most popular film in Iceland for 2008. As far as I know, it's one of, if not the most commercially successful films to have come out of Iceland, and obviously kickstarted Kormákur's career. He went over to Hollywood a couple of years later and remade another film of his called Reykjavik Rotterdam, and it's based on the most successful writer in Iceland at the time, at least, and yeah, it's pretty good.
Yeah, I can totally see why it had a lot of mass appeal, because it's an absolutely classic crime story, isn't it? A crime drama. I mean, to me, it felt, and I actually don't mean this as an insult, it may sound like one, it seemed to me, like a kind of Sunday night ITV crime drama. But
ITV.
Maybe that is a bit insulting, but with perhaps, more of an inventive story and high production values. It's the kind of thing that I think you probably weren't seeing on TV in 2007, but that you are now. And to me, I think TV is now much more the domain of this kind of detective procedural than film in many ways.
Absolutely. And I kept watching it thinking, this seems rather slight for a crime thriller. I'm basically deep in The Bridge, the TV series, the Swedish one, which tells us similar stories, but they're much more complex and there's far more characters and it spans 10 episodes. And I sort of kept thinking, this is awesome, but it's not The Bridge. It doesn't have those production values and it's not as necessary. Just everything seems to happen really fast.
I think also it's the classic case of I used to devour things, Agatha Christie's, so Miss Marple and Poirot, which obviously are massively different to this, but it's the same premise that you have usually an hour and a half to rattle through a murder, who our suspects are, why they might have been involved, and get to the end. And suddenly you're just like, it gives it a very kind of contained feel. But I think more so, this feels more like something like Midsummer. I'm not going to say that, actually, that's too hard. I actually really enjoyed this film, and I don't mean this as an insult to say it feels like something like Midsummer Murders, but I mean in that it feels very contained. So really, we don't have many suspects. We're not introduced to that many characters. So we kind of know from the start that these two storylines are heading towards one another. And it quite quickly becomes clear that there's only one logical conclusion to that. Did you think so?
Yes, and I was going to ask you about that because I can't quite remember how I felt after I watched it the first time. Because I think I said before, this was the first Icelandic film I ever saw. It's the only one I've ever seen at the cinema. And that was obviously way back in 2008. I think that's when it came out in England, maybe 2007.
Hæ,
Sæl.
það sama.
Já, hvað á maður að fá sér annað?
Mér sýndist nú íbúðin hans að hann væri bara svona einmanna táfýlukall. Það var einhver kona sem vilja búa með svona manni.
Það ekki þarna líkamsárás ungan mann sem batt niður og lék sér að skera í andlitið með brotinni flösku. Ellið einn frægasti misindismaður landsins.
Ekki bara mála að framlengja dómnum hans og loka málinu og allir hressir.
Þetta sem hún lærir í Ameríku.
Ég drep henni fíblið ekki ef ég út.
Það ekkert eðlilegt við það að missa barn.
Hvað það getur ekki verið 10 skalli?
Ekki segja mér hún sé dólít. Klipptu grip!
Hefur þú ekki pælt í því að þeir vita allir að ég er dóttir? Pabbi? Það líka var að bögga mig á því.
En hvað föður hennar? Ekki var hún engillinn?
Holberg nauðgaði stúlku nokkrum árum áður en Grétar hvarf.
Þetta var engin helvítis stöðgun.
Hefur þið verið nauðgað?
Hæ?
Skítalykt af þessu.
It's a bit like in a TV romance or a film romance that the first person you see a character interacting with is always the person they end up with. You know, the best friend from the beginning or the guy they bump into or whatever. It's always the person at the end. And that to me is a kind of how often these crime dramas work, that a person that you're introduced to at the start kind of has to be the murderer at the end. Because if at the 5 minutes towards the end you're introduced to a new character and they're the murderer, you'd feel quite robbed.
Feels like a cop-out, yeah. So we start with a random guy called Örn. His daughter looks very, very sick. She's in hospital. And then you see her, like, within 3 minutes, dead and lying on a table in a really kind of striking and nasty image, which kind of sets the tone, I suppose. It's like, yeah, this is about death and the death of children and what that means and what history and what that can force, or not necessarily force, but motivate people to then do. And so you see Örn and you're like, okay, we don't really know who you are, but we know your daughter's died. And then instantly we're off with Detective Erlendur, curmudgeonly but quite funny.
Yeah, 100% quite funny. What did you think of Erlendur?
I like him, and I have a soft spot for that actor anyway, Ingvar E Sigurðsson. And I think that's probably because this was the first film I saw, and he's popped up in a lot of things since. I'm going to say it again. He's in Trapped as a policeman, a very different policeman.
Really?
As is the actor who plays his sidekick, or one of his sidekicks, Sigurður Olli. The actor is Björn Hlynur Haraldsson. They both turn up in Trapped, but as very, very different characters. But Erlendur himself, like, I really warm to him.
Yeah.
And I don't know why, because when I read the books, I really don't. I feel like he's far more engaging and empathetic and sympathetic in the film than he is in the books. He comes across, for me, in the books as very cold. And even with his daughter, who we'll talk about in a minute, in the books, it's a much more fractious relationship. Whereas here, he knows what he's doing. He's very, straightforward, to the point, but also funny.
Yeah. Well, I kind of get what you mean. I can see how that translation would happen from the page to the screen, in that he was cold. If you looked at the script of this, you would think he's really cold and clinical. Whenever he's angry, he's not really shouting. He's just kind of coldly punching people or
There's
whatever.
like a mini Jack Reacher moment at his flat. My recollection of that character is not that, but
Yeah. But also, even when he's, when he's being kind to his daughter, he's showing his kindness through deeds, isn't he? Not through words or expressions necessarily, but I think it's something in the performance that gives it that warmth. So even though he's being, a classic man-shaped man, detective, I am traumatized, I engage with no one, there is something kind of behind that, whether it's in his eyes and the kind of like tiny little micro expressions that you get from him. So I think it's definitely performance based. Maybe you're meant to read between the lines in the book to get that, but
possibly. I mean, I guess that just goes to show what a performance it is and how he manages to imbue the character with such depth of kind of emotion and character.
He definitely falls into the classic detective in fiction or TV stereotype, which is harrowed by the things he's seen over the years, can't have a functioning normal life. He's always eating a takeaway. We'll come back to that. But,
sure.
And he's got this difficult relationship with his daughter. I feel like that's such a trope, isn't it? There's never a detective who just goes home and is like, "Hi, kids.
Hi.
I closed the door on my day and now I've totally got a normal functioning life."
Oh, absolutely not. No, he's got no wife to be seen. A heroin-addicted daughter who is pregnant by God knows who, and this seems to be just general behaviour from her. And he cares, and he obviously pays off her debtors and whoever else he needs to, and he's just like he's the classic. There was a similar character in a film. It's going to be the first of two connections to the Saw films I'm going to make. But in Saw 2, we get Donnie Wahlberg as Detective Eric Matthews, and he's very much, I have a terrible home life. My entire world is like being a policeman, but he actually is much more of a knob than Erlendur is. But that is such a classic thing of like, no wife to speak of. You've probably pushed them away for some reason. It's probably to do with work. And your children are also very dysfunctional. We see it a lot, don't we?
I thought while we're talking about the relationship with his daughter, that there was some interesting parallels there, weren't there, with the film we watched last week, Let Me Fall.
Yeah.
Because, of course, in fact, the daughter almost looked like Magnea, who's the central character in that film, who plays the addict. And this kind of father-daughter relationship in which there was a similar dynamic as well, in that the father is kind of saying, you can stay here as long as you need. I'm not going to break your balls for being an addict. Well, he kind of comes to that in the end, doesn't he? And just protects her, but is also quite kind of chilled.
Let her get on with her life and see if she'll make the right decisions, because obviously she's pregnant, and he's hoping that will
there was definitely definitely rang some bells there with Let Me Fall and the relationship of Magna and her father.
Completely. And it just goes to show, like, drugs have always been a thing in Reykjavik, in Iceland, which is not surprising. And the first time we see her, actually, we see her running. She literally meets him outside of the police station. Like, she's not afraid. I mean, I guess they all know, and they say they all know who she is and what she's like. She comes running out of Hlemur, which is the bus stop in central Reykjavik, which at the time was basically just a hangout for the homeless and, you know, troubled people, but it's now some sort of major exotic food hall.
Oh, really?
It's had a rather big makeover. I haven't been there since it was like that. But she just comes plodding up to the police station, just like, I need some money, right in front of Ellenborg, his other sort of partner, and makes no bones about it. But Erlendur, while he eventually wants to do the right thing, but at that point, he's just like being quite mean to her, don't you think?
Yeah, but I mean, again, we're back to the same issues that we were discussing last week about the toll that addiction takes on your family and your relationships, and how these people are put up. The inference is that he's put up with years or months of this kind of cycles of behaviour and stuff. So I don't know. I think we're definitely on his side throughout, aren't we?
Yes, but that's only the very small part of the story that kind of just feeds into the theme of family as a whole.
Yeah, which I thought was interesting because it's all channeling towards the same theme, isn't it? Because quite often you'll have subplots that explore kind of different themes, whereas this subplot was all about the same thing, which is your responsibility to your children, genetics, relationships between parents and children, and passing things down.
Well, exactly. What I thought was interesting, and you wouldn't know it from the film, but later on in the books, Sigurður, who in this film is kind of the comic relief, he's used as comic relief. A sort of storyline of his is that he can't conceive with his wife, I think, and they start thinking about adoption or, you know, IVF and stuff. And I just thought fascinating that the one character who isn't really involved in the family stuff in the film later on becomes quite a big part of his own personal story. But Sigurður, he's the young, he wants to be the cool detective in contrast to Erlendur, who's seen it all, like you say, wears his lopapeysa, smoking, just standing maskless even when there's like horrid stenches everywhere. And their relationship I found to be one of the most engaging.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that the kind of light relief offered in that relationship was needed, and also was needed for Erlendur. So we see him not just being somber all the time. And even when his colleague says, oh, you know, you got your sense of humour back, and he says, what sense of humour? But still, there's something a bit more to him there. That is
his sense of humour, though. He's like, you think I'm joking? I sort of am, but I'm not. But I think that literally the previous line to that is my favourite line of the film, where Sigurður's like, Ellen's like, makes you think, and Sigurður's like, yeah, people often said I didn't look like my parents. And Erlendur turns around and he said, I've always thought the same thing. It's like, what? That you're a bastard.
Yeah. Well, hey.
I love it. It's very good. He walked into it, but it was very funny.
Yeah.
But back to the main story, we find this man, Holberg, dead in his basement apartment, which is grimy, and, you know, the house, everything about this film is obviously it's Iceland in 2008, but Iceland in 2008 looks very much like Iceland probably did in 1962 or something. And that basement flat that we find him looks
looks unclean. Can I also just say I love the kind of shameless shorthand of being like, he's got a copy of Lolita. Do you know what that means? He's a pedo.
Yeah, I was like, we said it before, it's on the nose, that one. Like, he's got a picture of a girl on his computer, he's got Lolita. Yeah,
it was like, we've only got a 90-minute running time. We don't have time to be more subtle than that. You all know what it means. Let's carry on.
I was going to ask whether you thought paedophiles actually read Lolita.
Why were you going to ask me that? I don't know.
I don't know, you're a learned person.
I I couldn't tell you.
No, okay, fine. I just thought it's just an interesting thought that maybe, I guess, I don't know. Do they look up to Humbert Humbert? Do they look for inspiration? I don't know.
I'm not sure.
What's he getting out of that?
I'm not sure it's incredibly watertight, that moment there.
No, but but like you say, it signposts for us who he is.
When you
very easily.
You just mentioned there about the flat being so gross, and I think there was quite a lot of grossness throughout the film, but like not in a kind of explicitly gory or gratuitous way, but more of just like a kind of ugh way. Like the sections where we have, say, obviously we have brains in jars, and we have rotting skeletons and things, but the scenes where we have like dead bodies or whatever in the morgue cut in with meat, people eating meat. There's so much meat eating in this, and that to me,
a lot of meat eating
is kind of, I think because we don't actually see that much violence, there's kind of an inference of something horrible happening there. In that, when like when Erlendur's eating, first point here, who the hell gets a sheep's head from a drive-through? But
well, I'll address that in a second.
I'll address it. Fair enough. When he's sucking the eyeball out of the sheep's head,
eye hole.
The eye hole. Thank you. Yeah, the eye hole. There's definitely some kind of visual imagery there, I think, to make up for what we're kind of lacking in explicitly horrible stuff.
Heyr og raust mína ég kveina. Varðveit líf mitt fyrir ógnum óvinarins. Skýl mér fyrir bandalagi bófana, fyrir óaldarflokki illvirkjana. Leggja örvar sínar, beiskeirðin á streng, til þess að skjóta í leyni á hinn ráðvanda.
Maybe, but I think the film's so bleak and kind of just, I don't know, vast and just nothing, and very kind of understated in that way, that the moments we do have of actual violence are really kind of brutal and, what's the word, visceral. Like,
yeah,
it really has an impact. There's only like 3 moments of any kind of violence.
What are you thinking of?
I'm thinking explicitly of Ellie nutting Sigurður Ollie at the prison,
yeah,
like, lifting up the table, headbutting him, and then sort of fighting with all the guards. Did you recognise the actor who played Ellie, by the way?
Oh my god, I didn't till this very moment, because you saying that has inferred that I should recognise him. It's from Rams, isn't he?
Yeah.
See, I knew he wasn't to be trusted in Rams. I knew it.
I know. It's kind of interesting because he's terrifying.
Really,
Theodor Juliusson.
Yeah, really scary.
He's a really scary man in this, and you kind of, his character I can't remember which brother now in Rams, but
he's the naughty brother. No, he's
Kiddy. Yeah, and Kiddy's the more aggressive, the slightly more alcoholic prone, and you can kind of see that there's the similarity in character there, even though Ellie doesn't have any hair at all.
Anyone who has their head that closely shaved, beware. There's
something going on.
Yeah.
See, I could never do that because I have one big mole on my head. So if I shaved all my hair off, I wouldn't look Nordic at all.
I don't think you'd look very intimidating.
No. Not with a big old mole, anyway. But there was that moment, which I thought was incredible, especially like because the soundtrack goes. We've had all this sort of choral music, the police choir singing, the hymns and stuff, and in that moment, in the mix of the sound, you can hear sort of other voices coming from cells and it all rises up, and it really feels like a really harsh, brutal moment. And that comes from obviously from the performance of Theodor Ulysson, but also the way it's been soundtracked.
Sígarettur og sjónvarp í klefann. Svo væri gott að fá hóru svona einu sinni í mánuði. Til dæmis stelpuna hans. Þeir segja tussan á Evelyn sé bleik eins og svíni. Ódýrasti drátturinn í bænum.
Hvaða konu varst að tala? Hvaða konu varst að tala?
He was really one of the kind of big meaty performances of it, wasn't he? You know, like when we've got quite an understated cast of characters so far, really, haven't we? And then he comes in all guns blazing, like some kind of Guy Ritchie gangster movie. Like really full-blooded performance, which I enjoyed and I thought was quite funny at points as well as kind of scary.
Especially when he's like crying because he can't handle isolation. You're like, come on, you're meant to be what do they call him? Like the most notorious maniac in Iceland or something.
Yeah.
And then they call him that on the way there. That Erlendur sees him crying in his cell. And what does he say? He says, "You're the worst kind of moron I've ever seen."
But I think I quite liked that actually, because he's not like, I liked the fact that he's not some criminal mastermind, is he? He's just a big, violent thug, really.
Yeah.
Who doesn't have any boundaries. And that, in a way, makes him more believable, makes him more scary than if he was, you know, masterminding some evil scheme.
Quite. And as far as I'm aware, there's not that much, like, full-on murder going on in Iceland. Not like Indriðason's novels would have you believe, anyway. Or, like, if you read every Indriðason, Ragnar Jönsson, Yrsa Sigurðardóttir novel, that's probably more murders than I assume have ever happened in Iceland. I could be wrong. But, like, that's basically the only prison as well. And you just think, but what are people going to prison for? Probably just for, like you say, being brutal to various people. I mean, why is he there? Do we actually find out why he's there?
I'm not sure we find out, but the inference is he's done a lot of bad stuff.
He's done a lot of bad
in
stuff.
His time.
Yeah, especially with the group of men who are the prime suspects.
Yeah. One aspect I wanted to mention, which I thought was really interesting, was this like repeated thing that came up again and again about everybody knowing each other. So obviously we have Ellie, of course, says to Erlendur, you know, slags off his daughter and says, you know, I know her, everybody knows her, and some other things too, shall we say. But we also have when I think it's Ellen, her name is the sister,
Kolbrun's sister, yeah.
Yeah. She says, "Oh, this police guy," and instantly Erlendur's like, "Yeah, know who you mean."
That's Runa Gíslason.
Yeah, exactly. And this kind of idea that everybody is like one stage removed from each other, I think is an important, it seems kind of incidental, but I think it's actually quite important in terms of the idea about genetics and everybody being interconnected.
Yeah. It's the theme of the film, isn't it? Like, if everybody knows each other, it must be really hard to get away with murder, for one, although somehow murder has managed to avoid being solved for 30 years.
I was also thinking, just in terms of, you know, saying, do you know this detective? Oh, yeah, I know. And I was like, what? But if you think about, say, if there's 350 people, how many police? 350,000 people, I should say.
Yeah.
How big's the police force? I mean, for the whole country is presumably not going to be much bigger than, say, like a police force in one of our cities would be.
Oh, yeah, it's not even that, probably. I imagine, like, a couple of hundred people, maybe. I don't have the stats for that, but you can tell just by the nature of their offices. Like, there's no budget or anything. They're just a classic little room with a desk, and there's no. I mean, I know we're in 2008. This was the time of like CSI showing how you could zoom in to the tiniest little pixel of a number plate, and in this film, you've got basically nothing.
But I quite enjoyed that. I think that is something you can tell it comes from a novel, that it's all about talking to people and unpicking their connections. And it's all about kind of establishing relationships and people and characters' narratives. It's not about, like you say, oh, DNA found in the footprint. We don't even care about any of the stuff given at the crime scene. It's not really even mentioned.
Well, no, and I thought I had that exact thought at the end when you see the flashback to the murder. Mm-hmm. And he's just like clearly in his bare hand holding an ashtray, and he drops it. I was like, probably fingerprints on that. But it's never mentioned because it's not... because A, they don't have a suspect initially.
But it's not really... Like you say, it's not really about that, is it?
No.
What it is just a character drama.
Mm-hmm. And by focusing on the character, it sort of helps you lean into that, the thought about this whole genetic database and stuff that it's using as a backdrop. It's not really commenting too much on, but it all feeds into the same thing, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And we should probably talk about that because obviously the murder somehow is related to the death of this young girl. And basically in the mid-90s, a research company was set up, a private one called Decode, in the attempt to kind of just to compile a database of all DNA of everybody in Iceland, which is a really good idea in a way, so they can sort of trace lines of genes for disease and then hopefully put a stop to it. But it was very, very controversial, and, people were against it. Some people didn't want to put their DNA in, and it ended up having to become a voluntary database. But then it throws up these questions of like, well, if we do discover something about a certain familial line that they carry a gene, a faulty gene, do we tell them? Or do we not tell them and let this disease keep going? And like, I guess the major crux of this film is that one of the characters just accesses the database very easily, it seems, to find out what he needs, and that kind of leads to the murder, doesn't it? I wonder, is it saying anything about Decode, do you think?
I didn't read it that way so much, actually. I read it more as kind of a commentary on the fact that Iceland had this really interconnected genetic history. I mean, obviously it reveals that it would be a system kind of open to exploitation, but I don't think that they're necessarily shown to be doing something evil. They're not really all kind of morally corrupt. The company themselves, I don't think, is particularly shown like that.
Hugmyndin að gagnagrunnum svo að draga saman upplýsingar erfðir allra Íslendinga og nota síðan niðurstöðurnar til að búa til nýjar aðferðir til að lækna, til að linna þjáningu og fyrirbyggja sjúkdóma. En Kári, það siðferðilega réttlætanlegt að nota persónulegar upplýsingar á þennan hátt? Þetta er náttúrulega erfið spurning að mörgu leyti, en ég held að ef það einhver réttlæting á því að nota persónuupplýsingar, þá það til þess að finna aðferðir til að linna þjáningar og lækna sjúkdóma. Upplýsingar arfgenga sjúkdóma eru ekki endilega persónuupplýsingar. Það eru upplýsingar sjúkdóma sem flytjast frá einni kynslóð til annarar, og þetta þess vegna vandamál samfélagsins.
So also we have, I can't remember who it is, it's possibly Erlendur, that says, oh, you have everybody's stuff on file here. What? And the guy that works it says, yeah, but in the hope that we can make the future better.
Yeah, totally.
And I feel like that's played quite sincerely. It doesn't seem like it's some kind of corporate evil corporate scheme. No,
I agree with that. And I think that's probably the truth to the real life situation as well.
But I think it is interesting. This is like one of those incredibly vague anecdotes, but I know that there's been issues to do with people using stuff like Ancestry.com and those kind of sites where people, where people get their, is it 23andMe where you get your DNA profile done and it can say, you're 10% Middle Eastern and 20% Northern European. People using that data to get people for crimes, because it might not be, not that the criminals would have registered on that DNA database, but say they're son or their uncle or their brother has, then it's a match in that system and then can be traced back to them. But obviously that's ethically really dubious. Well,
sure.
One argument would say, it's solving crimes, so surely that's a good thing. Because if you get enough people signed up to it, quite quickly you're kind of narrowing off a lot of avenues.
Yeah.
But then other people would say, I didn't upload my data for that purpose.
Quite.
Especially if it could convict, say, like, your own family member. So, yeah, it's an interesting kind of dilemma where when DNA forensics and, like, genetic forensics, I don't even know if that would be the right word to use, genetic forensics kind of come together.
Yeah. What I read that Decode was trying to do initially was add was to get all that DNA information, which does exist, through, I assume, doctors and things like that, and hospitals, I don't know. But, like, to join that with because Iceland's got, like, a complete history of everyone's genealogy dating back over 1,000 years. And that's all just up on the internet as a database for Icelanders to access and have a look at, to learn about their, fairly recent family tree, rather than they can't go crazy in depth. But, like, imagine if you could combine that with DNA. Like, that would just be absolutely mad. You'd just be able to solve all sorts of things, probably, if you were able to have access to it. Yeah. But I think the film doesn't necessarily say anything either way, but it's like, look what we've got. Look how it could be abused, but look how it could be useful. Sort of just showing every avenue.
I thought it was intriguing, wasn't it, that he was able to be like, okay, there's one person in this massive database that we can connect it back to. Mm-hmm. It definitely felt like, again, that idea of everybody's interconnected, it's all part of the same chain link. And
the film does quite a good job of misdirecting you, even though it can only be a few people, of, like, while they're investigating who Holberg could have raped to produce another child. I can't remember if I actually knew that there was a child of rape, but the way that because you see Urn's mum at the start at the funeral for Hjola, the young girl who dies, and then you see her get interviewed, but I'm not sure if you're supposed to remember that it's her or not.
I didn't, I have to say.
You didn't?
No.
Okay. Because then, at that point, she's saying, I'd remember if I'd been raped. And just sort of flatly denies that there's ever been any kind of sexual meeting going on. And then it's actually quite funny when she finally decides that she should admit to having had intercourse with Holberg. But it's way too late, and they already know it's not true. Like, you did have sex, but you weren't raped. Actually, that was one of the things I was going to ask you. How do you think the film handles the whole rape stuff? Because it seems a bit dodged to me.
Yeah, I found it a bit uncomfortable. I mean, I would obviously cut it some slack because it's 13 years old or whatever now. So I don't think that it would be made now in the same way. Like, definitely some of the humour about, we have to go and ask all these women if they were raped 30 years ago. Now, I don't think that would play for laughs in the same way, and it definitely felt slightly uncomfortable. I don't think it felt misogynistic, weirdly. I think it just felt ill-judged. And also, I would say, I just think any kind of storyline I would be wary of that would have a woman falsely crying rape, because I just think that's, difficult territory to get into when obviously the majority of cases are not that. I just think it's a slightly... that's the noise I would make. That's
basically the noise that ran through my head during, especially the car scene where they're discussing how to approach it, and then because I can see why it's funny, why they're knocking on the door and not knowing how to deal with the situation. How's it gonna do? But then, like, actually just yelling, "Have you been raped?" at an old lady isn't really funny, is it?
I'm gonna say no. It definitely maybe hasn't aged well in that regard.
No, I think maybe that's kind of the one hangover from 101 Reykjavik maybe in Kormákur's kind of writing,
Yeah.
That he hadn't quite let go of his kind of lad part of his brain. Because there's even a joke about animal sex in the film, like there was in 101 Reykjavik. I don't know if you spotted that. When he's looking at the porn magazine in the lorry.
Yeah.
It's just like, what? I mean, it's just a little aside, but weird. I don't know whether Kormákur's kept one in every one of his films since.
Oh, God. I hope not.
That wouldn't be a great calling card, would it?
No. It's a bit of a like, oh, shocking, you know. We're so shocking.
Yeah. We basically have Erlendur is hunting down the murderer. They've spoken to Ellie about what he knows, which isn't that much really. And so then we know that it's like there's a group of absolutely despicable men working together to just be arseholes and sleeping with lots of people. And obviously it turns out that Urn's mother did sleep with Holberg, and their child is Urn, who carries the faulty gene, which is what Auður died of, which is what Kola died of. And is that enough of a motive for murder? I'm not sure how much I felt Urn's sort of final moments.
So I think on paper, when you put it like that, then no, it isn't. But I think it was quite well kind of played out in that obviously he hadn't intended to murder him. He'd gone to his house to confront him and things escalated. And that to me did feel kind of relatively believable, that he was, they were tussling, he was provoked, and he was also very disgusted with this man that he just found out was his father. Obviously that's quite traumatic, and dealing with the death of his daughter, which obviously then his father, because he's the carrier of this genetic disease, is an easy vessel to blame for that. So
yeah,
I know what you mean, that perhaps it was a bit like played out like a lot of murders on TV do play out, a confrontation that then leads to violence. But that's probably how a lot of murders do play out. So
yeah,
I thought it was relatively convincing.
And we'll come back to some other stuff, but the final shot, so that's one other moment of violence. And then the final moment of violence is when Erlendur brings the brain from, which we haven't spoken about Jar City at all yet.
I have a lot of issues with taking a brain home to your flat with you.
Okay, go on.
I feel like that's very unethical, isn't it?
Well, I quite liked how casual everyone was about everything. Like, he talked about the coroner or the pathologist just eating a hamburger or chicken while he's got the heart on the plate. And Erlendur just walking out of the nondescript building behind the church just with a bag with a brain in it. Just felt as natural as anything, really.
There surely should be some checks and balances to make sure people aren't just taking a brain home with them.
Yeah, but there doesn't seem to be much security anywhere at all in this place. Like, Ern manages to just, defraud his own company and then go to a random building which isn't attached to his company and just get a brain out.
I felt like, there was a bit of kind of narrative...
sweeping it under the carpet.
Sweeping under the carpet, thank you, of certain aspects such as that, which is, oh yeah, I know that brain. Come with me. Here we've got a load of fetuses in jars, couple of brains, couple of legs and hands. What do you need? I don't believe that there's a room somewhere that has a random selection of organs in it. Why have they kept a brain from 30 years ago?
I don't know, but it
makes sense. Without the parents' permission. So,
well, they try to explain that away, don't they? It's like the body was buried without the brain, and they couldn't just exhume it and put the brain in, so it had to be kept in formaldehyde or whatever they said. Is that not a normal thing?
No.
Well, we'll have to ask whoever Indriðason, when he wrote the novel, whether he researched it, whether that's true, whether there really is a room full of brains and fetuses and all sorts. And that's the other moment that I was going to say looks a bit like Saw. It's so green. Like, Saw 2 is the greenest movie I've ever seen. And that room, and the corridor outside it just look exactly the same. You could have taken that shot of them walking in, seeing all the gross things around them, just supplanted that straight into like a corridor scene of a Saw film.
When you're talking about it looking green, just a note on the aesthetics, that it definitely had their crime drama of the 2000s aesthetic. I'm thinking of Memento and Seven. Memento's really washed out and kind of grey and bleak. It definitely had that aesthetic to it, didn't it?
Definitely. I mean, it looks like a Scandi-noir of the time. It was behind Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. It wasn't that far behind, but the rules or the aesthetics have been sort of established by that point. Even the bridge which comes after it is so just grey. Malmo and Copenhagen aren't just grey, but they do just look grey. Whereas here it's very blue and very white. I think it's the flashbacks that are mostly blue. But the film as a whole is just very kind of stark and white and grey, and a lot of that is because Iceland is very much those colours all of the time. And I quite like that it felt very Icelandic, because we spoke about it before, but this is the first time we've actually seen proper aerial shots of everything Iceland is famous for. So you see lava fields. I think even the cemetery that the bodies are buried in is a lava field. So you see that, you see steam rising, you see waves crashing, you see just little churches dotted in the landscape, and just everything that people would imagine is here. And that might even be part of the reason the film was such a success outside of Iceland. It's Scandi-noir had become a huge deal, and then suddenly there was this unfamiliar world of Iceland which people had heard about or were aware of these various things, and it's all here.
Yeah.
It very much looks like a noughties Nordic noir for sure. And actually, you talked about Seven, and Seven was a massive influence on Saw as well. So it all comes full circle. Yeah.
Stop bringing everything back to Saw.
So I've got Saw on the brain for another podcast, okay? But circling right back to that moment when they're at the grave and Erlender's delivering the brain to Ern so he can put it in the ground with Auðr. That's the third major moment of violence, isn't it? Did that come as a surprise to you when Ern turns a shotgun on himself?
No, I think there's only one way this film is going to end, right, at this point, because also I think we're not meant to hate Ern, are we?
No.
We're definitely meant to kind of sympathise with him, perhaps not obviously with the fact that he did a murder, but he's murdering for, if not good reasons, then understandable reasons. Grief.
Yeah.
And
like
anger.
You said, he didn't mean to murder necessarily.
Exactly. So I think quite often, don't you think, in things like this, if there's a murderer that we're on board with. They have to die at the end because we don't want to see them just carted off to prison and they have to the trial, blah 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 blah, and all the implications and the paperwork.
And that is exactly why the end of Dexter was the worst thing ever.
Why? What happened?
Well, it's been out for a long time. Spoilers. Dexter does not die, and Dexter should absolutely have died at the end of the final series of that program.
They probably wanted to keep it open just in case they wanted to bring him back.
Well, they have, and
Well,
it's
there
coming
you
back
go.
this year.
There you go. That's why.
To give him a proper ending, so hopefully he'll die this year.
But no, I think that quite often you're like, well, there's only one way that this is going to end here.
Yeah. And there are obvious clues to that happening from the beginning. Like, the moment when Erlendur meets Ern at the genetics laboratory, like, well, obviously it's him.
Yeah.
But if you haven't already figured it out, because it is a fairly straightforward, it's kind of twisted.
Also, didn't he give it away? Because Erlendur said, I'm here to see a brain or something. And he was like,
knew exactly which
I know
brain.
the brain. Got it. Come with me.
Yeah.
I mean, alarm bells should have been ringing right then.
But then that might be an example of sort of Erlendur's stoicism. He's just like, I'm not going to react. I'm just going to leave. And I can't remember what exactly he does next, but I'm sure he knows. I'm sure he got an inkling. And then obviously they find a sawn off shotgun end at the bottom of the bed, which happens. Obviously that happens like 2 minutes before we see this scene, but you know, I think he did have to die, didn't he? But then the good news is no more neurofibromatosis in Iceland.
Hooray!
Not that, because he could have just never had another child.
That would have done
and
the
it would
same
have been
issue.
okay. Yeah. But he didn't. Killed himself. So that was pretty sad. But overall, it's a pretty thrilling film.
Yeah, I enjoyed
It zips along. It's just kind of a classic Scandi-Nordic noir crime thriller, but very much an Icelandic story.
Yeah.
And a lot of that is just due to the smaller details. Like, we'll go back to the svith that you talked about earlier. Svith being the boiled lamb's head.
Not for me, I think.
No,
definitely not.
But it looks so enticing.
Anything with an eyeball, especially anything that's grey as well, is not for me. I just love that you can go to a drive-thru and get one though. It's amazing.
So that place, I don't know if it's still like that because I've not been there for a while, but that's the main bus station, the other bus station. You see both the bus stations.
You have a very
in this
intimate
film.
knowledge of the bus stations of Iceland.
Well, it's because in Iceland, it's so perfectly planned for tourists that you get off the plane and no matter whether your plane has been delayed for any amount of time, there will be a bus there waiting to take you into town and to take you specifically to where you're staying as well.
Oh.
It's incredible. But they all go and come from that bus station, BSI. BSI, I'm assuming is the way you pronounce it in Icelandic. I'm not sure. But that is where the famous restaurant with traditional Icelandic food is. It's at the bus station. So he goes and gets his sheep's head, which is just clearly a regular thing for Erlendur, because she asks him if it's his usual. Can you imagine eating that every day?
Ugh.
I know, like we said before, like lamb is a kind of staple food in Iceland, or sheep in general, and he eats. Ava cooks a lamb stew, which looks. I'm not sure how good that looks either, but better than the sheep's head. But those little details.
Yeah.
And the way that Sigurðsson eats that sheep's head on screen is, if it's not acting, if it is acting, that's a masterclass in eating something revolting. But I'm assuming he probably does eat it in his real life.
It's probably delicious.
I can imagine the little bit of like cheek meat would be.
I'm willing to accept it might be delicious, but I still am fine not eating it.
But if we were given the opportunity to go and try it, would you try it?
I'd try it, yeah.
Yeah? Okay.
Go on then, as long as I was served it through a drive-through hatch.
Okay. Where would you take it then from there? Because you wouldn't eat it in the car like a Mackie D's.
Nah, you'd have to sit outside and eat it, I think. This has gone off grid, this conversation. Where would you eat a sheep's head in Iceland? Well, in terms of what makes it really feel just Icelandic, it's even things just like the jumpers worn by the detectives and the kind of little sea wind beaten shacks that we see.
Yeah, more corrugated iron.
Yeah, those little details definitely feel Icelandic.
Yeah, and it's that dark humour as well, which is what Erlendur really gives a lot. Like, even the moments when, because everyone's smoking again, and Sigurðsson is like, he's just had his nose broken. He's like, can you not smoke in the car? And he's like, just wind down a window. And we get like the wide shot of the Land Rover driving down Route 1. And it's like it is outside my flat right now, just blowing a gale, like a bit of snow. It's like, yeah, that's Iceland. Why would we open a window? You know, disgusting. So yeah, that was Jar City. A very Icelandic crime thriller.
Yeah, would recommend.
Would recommend. Sadly, they never made any more of them. Like, because there's a whole series, obviously, of books.
Which seems strange if it was one of the best grossing films in Iceland.
Yeah, it's kind of weird, isn't it? You'd think it's like, well, we made it. I don't know, obviously, how long it took to produce and get the funds and stuff. But as the #1 film in Iceland and a major seller, you'd think, yeah, keep going. But there you go. I'm sure they'll make it into a TV series one day. Yeah. It'll be the Icelandic Wallander. Although I think Kormákur has said that he wouldn't do it himself, because obviously he went and did Trapped, which is found out 3rd series later this year, which is very exciting. And obviously there's plenty more stories to write, plenty more murders to stick in the Icelandic landscape, you know. So yeah, thanks very much once again.
Thanks. What have we got coming up next week?
Next week, a very different film, part real, part fictional.
Okay. When you say part real, part fictional, do you mean part documentary, part drama?
That's exactly what I mean. Yes.
Okay.
And I'll be interested to rewatch this one to figure out what's what.
Ooh, okay. Lovely.
And it's very recent, actually. Jumping around with our times here, but that's okay.
Yeah. So I'll see you back here for that then.
Excellent. Thanks again. So there we have it. A taut and engaging crime drama with some great performances. What did you think of Jar City? Is this a superior Kormákur film? A faithful adaptation of the novel? And does it hold its own when compared to the Swedish or Norwegian crime adaptations? I'm thinking The Bridge, because that's just so bloody good. Or The Killing. Let us know your thoughts on Twitter, where we're at KvikmyndaPod. That's KvikmyndaPod. And if you enjoyed listening, please leave us a rave review on Apple Podcasts. It'll help spread the word and get us seen and heard by more people. Oh, and that film we'll be covering next week that I forgot to name will be Rúnar Rúnarsson's Echo, or Bergmál, from 2019, which is currently streaming on Mubi. For the most recent film so far on KvikmyndaPod, we're hanging around Reykjavik for a very special time of the year, Christmas and New Year. It promises to be exciting. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next week. Takk og bless. Thanks and goodbye.